Thank you. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to January Schools Forum meeting. Happy New Year, or at least I hope it's as happy as is possible under the current circumstances. Can I first of all ask Joe if we have any apologies for absence, please?
Thanks, Andrew. Apologies received from Becky Martin, Rachel Howie, Peter Hales, and also Steve Savory and Lynn Dance will need to leave the meeting at 3 p.m.
Okay, thank you. Can I just, at this point, just mention that I understand that it's the last meeting for Stuart Wilson and Dan Johnson. So could I just very quickly just thank you so much for all of your contributions to Schools Forum discussion over the last few years. And so we will miss you, but all the very best wishes for the future. Could we now go on to the notes of the last meeting, please? And first of all, could we go through for accuracy? So on page 2, any concerns over accuracy on page 2? If you just raise your hand as we go through. Page 3. Page 4. Page 5. Page 6. Page 7. Or page 8. Okay. So if there are no concerns, can I take those as being an accurate record of the last meeting then, please? Okay. And then again, if we go through for matters arising, there are a couple of action points that are on the action sheet, but just quickly to go through. So again, any matters arising that anybody's concerned about on page 2. Page 3. 4. 5. 6. On page 7, there are the 2 action points. I'll just finish off with matters arising, then ask for some, if there's anything about those action points. On page 8, anything that anybody wants to raise. So there are 2 actions on the action sheet. First is as to whether there's any update in terms of the analysis of data concerning the recent rise in EHCP requests. Phil.
A comment on that, Andrew? Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you, Phil. Yeah.
Sorry. Yes. So I'm expecting an update, a formal written update next week, and we'll share with members as soon as that's received. We've got headline data around where we are, but the more detailed review that I've asked for will be available next week.
Okay. Thank you very much, Phil. And the other point was about the as to why more boys than girls are being identified as having special educational needs and disabilities. And thank you very much to Lynn for forwarding to Joe, who then distributed the really interesting papers, which certainly are a very interesting read and give some insight as to why there are those discrepancies. So thank you very much for that. Could we now move on, please? I apologise. Pieces of paper in order. To the Gloucestershire County Council budget consultation. So, Sue, are you going to take us through this?
Yes, thank you.
Excellent.
Thank you, Andrew. So there's a few slides we'll just go through. You should have the papers in your bundle of pack, which sets out the position for next year's proposed investments, as well as the commissioning intentions, which I just put there for your information, which are quite thorough in terms of what the council, local authority, is preparing to do and has done over the last year and will do moving forward. So this budget was presented to Cabinet on the 16th of December, and following that presentation, it was then put out to consultation That period runs until tomorrow. So this is your opportunity to feed back in about the budget that is presented, and any comments that we receive today, we will feed back in through the budget consultation. The final budgets will then be submitted to Cabinet at the end of January and then to full council in February. So for children and families, that includes both children's services and education, the proposed investment is 9.43 million, with proposed savings of 0.116 million, giving a net position of 9.327 million. And I'll go through the detail of those in a moment. But just to say, the council has reflected the pressures that children's services have been under and continue to be under, and have put investment in to try and provide a realistic budget going forward, as well as linking in with the work that has been done by the children's services area to bring spend back into line with budget as much as possible. But some of these increases are beyond our control, and therefore additional funding has been needed. I've set out there what the forecast position is for. That was done in October. That was the latest published information. And again, as with all budgets this time of year, or this year in particular, it's really masked by the impact of COVID. So we've tried to identify what that impact is. So although we've got a 14 million overspend, we estimate that about nearly 7 million of that is to do with COVID, and that's would link in with additional costs and external placements. It will link into transitions. It will link into support in SEN, home to school transport, and most probably another and staffing as well. So the net position in October was about 7.7 million overspent. So that's the background to the investment the council is making. And just moving on then, just to give you a little bit more of a breakdown into the investments that are being proposed. So we're putting forward an external placement additional fund of 3 million. The underlying position at the moment is around 5, and we know that the 3 million is tight, although we have got an additional million being held in contingencies to offset that cost. And we are also putting further sort of proposals forward to the council to give us any additional funding to be able to afford those placements in the following year if there are any surplus funds that come up in the next month or so before the budget is finally agreed. I think there are obviously other areas that we're looking into, continually reviewing high cost placements. We've just opened Travone House, and young people, complex young people, are now being placed in Travone House, and we are also looking at other provision as well. Then we've got additional social work capacity, and that's 1 million of that is linked to the cost of agency staff. So we have got much less agency staff now. We've got about probably half of what we had from back in 2018. So somewhere around 90 agency staff, and they cost us more than our funded establishment. So we've got some funding to be able to cover that in year, and we are hoping to bring those agency staff down, the numbers down, as our newly recruited staff gain experience and are able to take up a full caseload. The other area we're putting support into is child protection and the IRO service there. Special guardianships is linked to the increasing trend to use this as a way of placing children in a long-term basis. These numbers have been increasing as the application for a sort of special guardianships came in about quite a few years ago now, but we're still on an upward trend. We're about 220 overspent this year, and so this funding will provide cover for that, as well as the increasing trend in 21-22. The next, pay awards and allowance inflation, that covers staff pay and also allowances on fostering, adoption, SGO allowances as well. And then one-off funding, so we're continuing the improvement journey within children's services. And we had by this time expected to have a full Ofsted inspection, but COVID has clearly delayed that process. And within that sort of scale of things, we've continued to keep on the additional staff and interims that we have, and that will cost us additional money during next year. So we've allowed for that as well. So just moving on then to the next slide. Bill? Was it me? Sorry, thank you. So one of the key overspends this year is home to school transport. So we have recognised that we need to put some more funding in, and that is really linked to the cost of SEN transport and the numbers of young people being transported across the county and out of county as well. And also the cost that we're seeing of solar journeys and re-procurement. So to maintain our standard of transport providers, we are having to put further funding into that budget to maintain that in the coming year. Support to children with SEND are clearly, as we've spoken about at Forum, is the number of the HCPs increasing year on year, between 300 and 350. We need additional staff to be able to manage that increase, and there's an additional 200k for that. And finally, just pay awards again in education and transport inflation. And just to pick up really, the vulnerable children and education, very few savings this year, with the main saving being against education, which is to do with the reducing commitments in the pension fund. So those are the key points I wanted to raise with the forum, and please provide any feedback about these proposals, which we will then collate and forward on to the budget consultation process. Thank you, Phil.
Okay, thank you. Does anybody have any questions for Sue about
Jackie Harris? Andrew, probably an idea to drop the slides actually, so we can.
Okay.
That point, yeah.
Jackie.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you. One question, please, about the consultation. Could you confirm what consultation arrangements have been made to ensure that chairs of governing boards throughout schools in Gloucestershire are aware of the consultation?
So this paper would have been is a public paper. This is just an extract of it. It would have gone to Cabinet in December, and it's a public document. So this document would have been available for all public and anybody to actually go and pick that up and respond to the budget consultation. So it's available for all Gloucestershire people to do that.
And have chairs of governors at schools been notified that the public document exists then? Or would they have to look for it?
I'm not aware of that, Jackie, but again, it's something that is on an annual cycle and is available to be viewed and is there for everybody. So I've not notified people that the budget is there, as I've not notified, I suppose, schools that the budget is there. But through this committee, we would hope to get feedback from the school sector on the budget proposals.
May I make a request, please, that a link to the budget documents are placed in WhatsApp Gov that is issued on a 2-week cycle to hopefully the majority of schools within the county?
Yes, I'm sure that's done, but just to note that the budget consultation does end, feedback does end tomorrow, so it's unlikely that that will be done, but it's a good point to note. I will ensure that it does go into the circulation papers, both for head teachers and for governors for next year. So we'll make that point available and make sure that happens, Jackie.
Thank you very much, Suzanne. It's a point that I've had to make pretty much every year to Schools Forum, and I would like to see that the chairs are always considered, because after all, it is the governing boards who sign off on budgets, not head teachers, although head teachers clearly have a large role to play within this. And I think just the representatives on the schools forum is insufficient circulation to the entirety of governors within the county.
Okay, thank you for that point.
So I assume this is something that could be noted for next year, so that governors are made aware of this consultation at such a time that they're able to respond should they so wish. Okay. Any other questions at all?
No one else indicating as far as I can see.
Okay.
Andrew.
All right. I need to make an apology. Due to some domestic distractions at the start of the meeting, I skipped over a couple of things which I should have done at the beginning. So can I ask at this somewhat strange stage if there are any declarations of interest that anybody wishes to make? And secondly, ask Joe if there are any public questions that we need to consider.
No, there's no public questions, and I can't see anybody indicating for a declaration of interest.
No, none.
Okay,
No.
all right. I'll say again, many apologies for that. Okay, could we now therefore move on to the item about the dedicated schools grant? Phil, please.
Yes, just resharing. I'm trying to unmute myself at the same time. Can we see the presentation again? I'm just checking this out now. So I've kind of structured this to take us through the kind of distinct elements of the DSG, each of the kind of the blocks. So the report's structured that way. To start with, just wanted to kind of summarise where the whole DSG was now after the kind of adjustments that have been made for 21-22. So this slide pulls out that kind of summary position from the report. What it's showing is the full position at the top there. From 21-22, the improvement and the increase in schools block is 34.626 million overall, 8.246 million on high needs, just over 200,000 on the essential services, and 469 on the earliest block, which sees a total DSG increase of 43.456 million, bringing the total to 524,114. Included in that are the numbers outlined below, the teacher pay and pension grant. So 18.25 million, 285 million of the 34.6 above is part of the teacher pay and pension grant being included in the DSG, and that's reflected across there. So the real increase, for example, on the high needs, the 2.255 million comes off of that 8.246 to give us the real kind of like for like increase in terms of the 2021 position. So that's the kind of overall position. And obviously last year we were for the first time in a position to fully fund the national funding formula for the schools block. It gave us an opportunity for the first time to be able to fully deliver the national funding formula. You'll note from the papers again, we're in the same position this year with a surplus in the block as well, which we've made a recommendation around. There's a kind of few things I just call attention to within the schools block and the funding formula. So sparsity funding has increased, and Neil and his team included some tables in there to show how that had increased or the impact of that locally. And you can see the comparison between 2020-21 and 21-22, an increase of just over 400,000 for primary schools and just around 12,000 for secondary. And the qualifying schools are shown on the right there. So we've got 2 primary schools that no longer qualify for that sparsity funding, and that'll be due to changes in the school population. And then the secondary schools have increased by 1. I guess the key thing in that is that what we're seeing is that small primary schools will see a benefit from that sparsity funding. That's where the key the sector in Gloucestershire is seeing the benefit of that increase. So sparsity funding. The next bit was just to pick up on the everybody's favourite subject, the minimum per pupil funding and minimum funding guarantees. Just to be clear on how those have changed. Like I said, the teacher pay and pension grant is included. We touched on this in the September forum, and that's £180 per primary pupil and £265 per secondary pupil. The minimum per pupil funding increased. The minimum guarantee increased for secondary to 5,150 and for primary to 4,000. That's an increase from 5,000 for secondary and from 3,750 for primary. The result of that is the minimum per pupil funding, including the teacher pay and pension grant, is now at 4,180 and 5,415. Important to note that is including the teacher pay and pension grant. And I laugh because this is something that gets confusing all of the time for all of us, including me. But that is the total position, including the teacher pay and pension. So if you add the 180 primary to the 4,000, you're getting the 4,180 and 5,150 for secondary and 5,415. And the 265 gets you to the 5,415. And that is obviously for schools that are on the minimum per pupil funding. There will still be schools that are above it. The guarantee that's in the formula that every school should see an increase regardless of where they sit in the formula, to make sure that everybody gets an increase is moved from 1.84% to 2% in this as well. And again, all detailed in the report. And I think Neil included in that the kind of breakdown of the formula itself in more detail. So if there are any questions around that, then we can pick those up. I thought it's also just worth noting the impact for schools in Gloucestershire and where this is moving us. So what we're seeing from this is more schools moving on to the minimum per pupil funding. So as the minimum per pupil funding increases, it's passing schools that weren't receiving that funding previously, that were on the just over the cusp of minimum per pupil funding. So we're now seeing this year a comparison, 33 more primary schools receiving the minimum per pupil funding. The impact on secondary is to see it go slightly the other way, with 3 reducing, and that is all about how the funding is moving up. And obviously for primary this time there was a slightly more significant increase with the move from 3,750 to 4,000 compared to the secondary, which was a smaller move from 5 to 5,150. So we're seeing more and more schools moving onto this and onto that kind of minimum per pupil funding level, which in essence is moving towards that kind of equity that is intended to be within the funding formula. And again, the number of schools that are on the minimum funding guarantee, again, you'll see because of that increase in the minimum funding guarantee from 3,750 to 4,000 and then 5 to 5,150, we've got more schools that are on that MFG now. So I guess in summary, I mean, our ability to impact this formula locally is entirely limited. It is the formula that has been rolled out. We are able to fund it fully again this year. It leaves a surplus in the block of 0.643 million, which we have recommended to be used in the same way as we did last year to support the 1 in 40 model, which we'll come to in a second as a recommendation. All schools will see a per pupil funding uplift this year, regardless of where they are in those formulas, due to the 2% minimum. like I say, more schools are on the minimum per pupil funding and minimum funding guarantees than last year, quite significantly more at primary. Small schools in the county, those in the small rural schools in the county, should see the benefit of the increase in sparsity, and that we're now in a position where the teacher pay and pension grants aren't things that schools have to apply for, are part of the grant, and we can safely assume will be part of the grant for the following year as well. So that's kind of summary, which left us with the 3 recommendations which were in the report. I'll leave it there for questions on that one, if that's okay.
Okay, thank you very much, Phil. Does anybody have any questions on the presentation, Phil, so far?
Sarah Murphy.
Sarah.
Hi, Phil. With regards to the teacher pay and pension, I'm just wondering whether you have any information on the number of schools that have applied the pay rise from the 1st of September 2020, because obviously through my casework I'm seeing some teachers whose schools are not, or at least are not even following the school teacher pay and conditions document recommendations. There's now an annex in that document that suggests the different pay points for teachers. Do you hold any central data over whether pay rises have been given, and if so, how much?
It's not some. Just checking to come on. Sorry. Yeah, it's not something I've got data on at the moment. It's certainly something we could look to get for maintained schools if it was of interest. Obviously, for academies, it would be reliant on academies wanting to share that information, because that's entirely within their gift. So my only view on it at the moment would be an anecdotal one, but I'd be more than happy to collate that and bring that to a future meeting if that's helpful to see.
I think it would be helpful. In my opinion, there seems to be a growing disparity between what a particular point and value of pay is on different pay points in different schools, both through local authority and obviously academies. So that any information would be really useful to share. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Sarah. Any other questions at all?
No one else with a hand up, Andrew, as far as I can see.
No. Okay, can we therefore move to the recommendations? So the first recommendation essentially is that the forum notes the dedicated grant settlement for 21-22. There isn't a vote to be taken on that. And given that we've only had the one question, I think we can accept that the forum has noted that the DSG settlement. Okay. The other recommendations are slightly more complicated in that we do need potentially to take a vote, but there are some limitations on who can vote on each recommendation. So if we look to the second recommendation, which is that the schools forum recommends that the council agree the school funding formula for 21-22 as set out in Appendix A. So Appendix A is the same as page 32, but with the area cost adjustment applied. This voting is limited to schools members, academy members, and PVI representatives. And therefore, if you'll apologise me being fairly direct, the following people are not eligible to vote. So that's Penny Chislett, Rachel Howie, Sarah Murphy, me, and Helen Bond. Okay, so for the remaining members, can I ask, we'll do this as we did in the last meeting, rather than taking a full vote for every recommendation. Can I ask if there is anybody who is likely to want to vote against that recommendation or abstain from it?
No one indicating, Andrew.
Okay, so therefore, in much the way that we would if it was a meeting at Shire Hall, I think we would take the feeling of the meeting as being in agreement with that recommendation, and therefore we will do that at this stage. So therefore we'll take it that the forum does recommend that the council agrees the school funding formula for 21-22 as set out in Annex A. Okay. If we move on to recommendation 3, recommendation 3 is about the use of the balance of the school's block funding, and as to whether that should be used as a one-off contribution to support the continuation of the 1 in 40 high needs model. And for this, all forum members are eligible to vote. So it's not just school members, academy members and PVI. So can I ask again whether there is anybody who would want to vote against or abstain from supporting this third recommendation?
No one indicated, Andrew.
Okay, so as before then, can we take then that the forum does agree with that recommendation of the use of that balance as a one-off contribution to support continuation of the 1 in 40 arrangements? Okay, which takes us to early years, Phil.
Okay, I'm just going to re-share slides. So I'm hoping you can see the slides again now. So there's, I guess, two parts to this conversation around early years. I think the starting point is around the details that were provided in the initial Dedicated Schools Grant report, which was looking at the increases in funding rates for 3 or 4 year olds and 2-year-olds based on the government guidance and the increase in the early years block. The second part is around funding related to COVID, and it's a bit more complex. We've shared an additional report about that, and I'll go through that one in a second. But if we start with the early years block as it was intended, I mean, this feels like a relatively straightforward one, but it's literally what we've done here is make the recommendation in line with government guidance around the use of the increase funding that's coming into the earliest block, which is to apply a 6% increase for 3 and 4 year olds and an 8 pence increase for 2 year olds. Total increase there is shown in the tables in the report. 476,895 impact, and that is within that increased funding allowance. I think broadly, the feedback, and I guess Amanda and Gwyneth will be able to share more from the sector, but the feedback we get from the sector is that is close to the minimum that they would have expected, and not on the positive side of minimum. I think the sector was hoping for much more, and so in essence we felt the only way to approach this is to recommend to approve, to push those increases through as recommended by government. So that's the first part, and I think I'll just stop there on that one so that we can look at that recommendation before moving on to the other report. Andrew, you're on mute, sorry.
I beg your pardon. So can I ask if anybody's got any questions about the early years funding that Phil has just covered? No? Okay, thank you. So therefore we have the recommendation.
Schools Forum.
Simon?
Simon, can you mute yourself?
So we have a recommendation, which is that the forum agrees to apply the 6.06 pence increase the hourly rate. The 6 pence increase in the hourly rate. Apologise for that slight double take. For 3 and 4 year olds, and the 8 pence increase for the formula for 2 year olds. So as for recommendation 2, this the members who are eligible to vote for this are the school members, academy members and PVI. So therefore, again, Penny Chislett, Rachel Howie, Sarah Murphy, Helen Bond and I are not eligible to vote for this recommendation. So can I ask from the other 4 members, is there anybody who would want to vote against that recommendation or abstain from it? Okay, thank you very much. In which case, we'll take it the forum has agreed to that recommendation. Phil, could I hand back to you now for a little bit more about early years? Phil, you're on.
Yeah, I'm juggling admin at my end here. Sorry, trying to move slides on that. So we shared a report earlier in the week around funding for this coming this term and the coming summer term for early years. I've tried to put in the context of that. It's clearly related to the situation around COVID and the fact that early years providers were asked to stay open during COVID. However, open during the latest national lockdown. So this kind of most recent announcement, when partial closes of primary and secondary were announced, early years was in a position where it needed to stay fully open. The funding guidelines around this. So obviously, for those that don't know, the way that the early years funding works is on a midpoint census. So the January 21 census funds autumn 2020 and the spring and summer terms for 21. And that works in the normal run of things without COVID. That works in that way every year. So you've got effectively a midpoint census in January that's funding the academic year. So it's that midpoint of the academic year. The government had agreed in the lead up and across the autumn term lead up towards Christmas that the autumn term would be funded based on the January 2020 census rather than the January 21 census, on the understanding that there was still going to be a recovery of confidence in the system around people wanting to send their children back to school and to, in this instance, settings. And we had seen an increase, I think, in returns across the autumn term as in the early days of the autumn term, improvements were starting to be seen across the country in rates of infection and COVID. Obviously, as we've got closer to Christmas, and then on the other side of Christmas, things have escalated again in a way that I think everybody's aware of. But the guidance was very much still forming the view that the January 21 funding for providers should be based on the January 21 census. And that census should reflect children and young people that were in settings, which would basically have seen us with a significant reduction in funding, because with the best will in the world, attendance wouldn't have been high enough to reflect a normal year. And that's notwithstanding, I think, the position around the change in the national lockdown. I think even without that, it would have still been in that place. And obviously, therefore, providers were also being told and by that guidance, and we were informed by the DfE, we were to fund based on places and attendance. We weren't of the view, and we'd had a lot of feedback from the sector around this, we weren't of the view that was a tenable position to take. I think the guidance from the DfE was that providers are able to access the funding for furloughing staff, etc., to offset costs. But the reality of running a provision, and I'm sure, again, Amanda and Gwyneth will have views on this, the reality of running early years provision doesn't make that practical. It just wouldn't work to offset costs in that way, particularly when you're trying to implement COVID safety on site, when you've got very young children on site. So our position really was earlier in the week was to present a paper that said we would like to utilise surplus that remains in the earliest block from the autumn term this year to offset that cost and fully fund places. That was and is a decision that had to be made by Schools Forum, because it's obviously use of the early years block dedicated schools grant. In the paper, I think I've tried to outline the fact that we were expecting things to change, and of course the environment we're now in, things are changing hourly, as Andrew will attest, because I spoke to him an hour and a half ago, and things have changed since then as well. So the position now is that the DfE have just an hour ago announced that they will allow us to complete the census based on what would be the normal expected attendance, not the COVID attendance. So the providers to be able to complete the census against the children that would be expected to attend, not those that are actually attending, which will mean that we will see the normal level of income into the early years block to support places. And the second part to that is they have agreed that that we are in a position to be able to fund the places rather than attendance. So the issue that was being outlined in the report, I think, is now resolved by DfE guidance. But I think I still wanted to air this issue, and frankly, it only changed about an hour ago, so we'd had the papers. But I think it was important to air this issue because it is one, I think, that the forum, was an hour away from having to take a decision on, and I think would have been a critical one for the sector. So I don't think we're now in a position where we need to take the recommendation, but I do think, like I say, I wanted to share the information, and I don't know whether Amanda and Gwyneth want to share anything about kind of the experience in the sector around this. But from a local authority perspective, we have seen a lot of and had a lot of feedback around this issue, and is one that's created great concern. So I wanted to be confident that they were seeing that people know that this was something that we were looking to address as a local area and as a schools forum. I will leave it there. I don't know whether anybody wants to comment or feedback on any of that.
Gwyneth, quite keen indicator.
Yes, sorry, Gwyneth, yes. Would you like to come in here? Gwyneth? You might.
Sorry, it wouldn't, for some reason, it wouldn't switch on. Yes, I just wanted to really reiterate, I mean, obviously, slightly, Amanda and I came firing on all barrels, ready to fight the great fight and shout to the end of shouts. And I feel slightly like the wind's been taken out of our sails, but I mean, it's fantastic news for us. Just to say, really, early years as a sector, I mean, I sent an email to various people, and I know Amanda did as well, and I've been inundated with emails from the Early Years Forum members. I don't think we've ever found a stage where the morale is quite so low as it is in early years at the moment. We are really struggling for lots of reasons. I think that and then the final blow to say that maybe action would be taken. Most settings would close, and the big question that we all wanted to raise, just in case it does come up in the future, is that then who has the responsibility for those children? If you're not going to pay us for the children, that's a reliance on our goodwill then to care for children who don't. I mean, I have at my Treadworth setting, we have got one of the highest infection rates in the county. Our own director is seriously ill at the moment in hospital. My staff are up against it daily. So to say we're not going to pay for the children who don't come as well, and my families who are so terrified, I can't really put it in any more sort of frontline words as to how difficult it is for us. So thank goodness we don't have to make that plea. But if it comes up in the future, Amanda and I'm sure we'll be shouting from the rooftops.
Okay, thank you, Gwyneth. There was next person had their hand up, I think was Sarah Murphy. Sarah.
Thank you, Gwyneth. I wanted to obviously just point out the obvious that I've been receiving a lot of casework from nursery staff members and obviously primary school members concerned and anxious over the whole COVID situation. But I've just been reading through our press releases, the National Education Union press releases, and I just wanted to obviously point out the obvious to the forum that the union has been lobbying very hard on behalf of early years funding and nursery schools. So I'm pleased with this change from the government.
Okay, thank you, Sarah. And Amanda, you raised your hand. Amanda?
Thank you. I just want to reiterate what Gwyneth said, and also that we were really pleased that the forum were putting forward a proposal to fund whether the DFE did or not. So that was really reassuring. It's very hard for these early years settings who are working day in, day out with children, lots of children, not just key worker children. And I think that it's really reassuring that you've offered us your support. So thank you for that.
Okay, thank you, Amanda. Are there any more questions? I don't see any more hands up. But any more questions at all?
Or Andrew?
No?
No.
Okay, thank you very much for that. Which I think takes us on to high needs. Phil.
Central Services Block first.
Sorry, I beg your pardon. I'm so sorry. I'm not doing well this afternoon. Central Services Block. You're quite right.
This is one I wouldn't. There's not a lot of detail behind. Frankly, we've seen a small increase in the Central Services Block, 205,000. We're not proposing to apportion that differently to the way we have in previous years. It's covering off the areas identified there, and goes towards the things like staff salary increases, etc., inflation increases that will sit within those kind of areas. So what we've done, I guess, is reinforce the kind of areas that we're currently utilising the Central Services Block, and where that additional funding will go. I don't know whether there's any questions around how that's used, or the increase. Otherwise, I guess we could move to the recommendation.
Okay, I see, Amanda, I think you've still got your hand up. I don't know. Are there any other questions? Are any questions about the Central Services Block?
Can't see any, Andrew.
Okay, so therefore, can we take the recommendation, which is for the forum to agree the allocation of the Central Services Block as set out on that table, and all members are eligible to vote for this recommendation. Can I ask if there is anybody who would want to vote against it or abstain from such a vote? Okay, thank you very much. So therefore, can I take it then that the Schools Forum does agree with the allocation of Central Services Block as set out in that table? Okay. And that takes us to high needs. Phil.
Yes, it does. Yeah. Right, so high needs. So I've included in the report the latest forecast around high needs. We have seen some movements since the last reporting. The key ones to note, I guess, independent special school places. We've seen a rise there of just over 200,000 in terms of the expected end point on independent special schools, and there's been variation in both primary and secondary, and these are the HCP top-ups, and these variations really this comes back to transitions that have taken place in the autumn term. More children and young people with EHCPs going into secondary than we were expecting. and slightly less in primary, and a slightly increased due to a higher unit cost rate in independent special schools. We did have one complex case that's come through that was an independent residential placement, which is significant costs that came in which we weren't expecting. Overall, we're still pretty much in line with the budget, as you can see as outlined in the report. We set out this year, and I guess saying it's an achievement to hit such a large deficit budget feels a bit strange and a bit perverse, but I think I articulated much earlier in the year a real ambition this year to really understand what's happening in this area and have confidence around the decisions we can make moving forward around high needs. And I think for those members that were on the forum last year, you'll note that our starting point was an expectation of a kind of a £1.2 million deficit, and it moved dramatically across the year to an end point that was significantly in excess of that, which obviously makes planning and decision making around how you tackle this issue very challenging. I'm going to come on to that in a bit more detail in a minute anyway, because I think that it's still challenging. But we're at a point this year where I think we're forecasting to be very close to what we expected, which I think is showing a much better place than we were last year. We are still significantly overspending, and I've shared more information on where we are, how that looks nationally, and some of the other issues. So I'll come to that specific issue around the national problem in a minute. But that's our kind of current forecast, reporting to come in there with a variance to budget of just over 23. So I don't know whether there's any questions or feedback around that, if I stop there for a minute.
Okay, thank you, Phil. Does anybody have any questions about that
None at the moment.
Data?
None at the moment, Andrew.
No? Okay, thank you, Phil.
On, and if anybody has anything later. The other thing that I'm continuing to report against in these reports, and I will keep continuing to do this, is the rise in EHCPs. These are two drivers, EHCPs and permanent exclusion. We're still seeing that rise, and the trajectories are still as we expected. That is what is keeping us broadly in line with budget, that we're seeing the rising level of need that we were anticipating. So EHCPs continuing to rise. As I said at the start, we're still looking at the impact of COVID on increases in applications for assessment, which I'll share as soon as that's available. And what I think we can expect a further spike in EHCPs over the coming 12 months as we see the effects of COVID, particularly with another national lockdown. I think it's something that we are expecting to see more need coming through the system. Permanent exclusion, again, I've included the tables in the report. We are broadly in line in terms of total numbers with the same period last year. The autumn was, for the first time in a while, a bit more comparable to the previous autumn, because more children were in school, notwithstanding there was the COVID issue with that, but there were obviously the majority of the school population was back in, so we were broadly in line. There was when you look at that data in comparison, it's slightly down in secondary, and it's hard to say extravagantly up, but it's up proportionally quite significantly in primary, because we've had 5 permanent exclusions in the primary sector, and we had very, very few in the previous year. So overall numbers are fairly similar, but we have seen a slightly higher rise in primary and a slight reduction in secondary permanent exclusion. The national picture, and I've shared some information about this. So there's been 2 organisations looking at this recently. And so I've shared the county Treasurer's report, which was part of the pack, which has got detail of a review they did of their members to understand where the high needs position was, and that summary report it gives kind of their picture of the situation. The F40 undertook a review as well, and we obviously contributed to that. They had I say significant 50% of local authorities replied to this, so it was a large response to something like this. We don't normally see that rate of response. There was a lot of background information around this. The two pieces of information I wanted to share really were where we were kind of as a total deficit, and you can see us there. I know that it's possibly very small on some people's screens, so I've put a nice arrow in there so we can see where we sit, and that is slightly further to the right than we would like in terms of the total deficit position. And this, as you can see, it's showing year on year how that's moved for different authorities. You can see where it's getting really bad in the system, and some of these numbers on the far right will make eyes water. Surrey are currently reporting an £80 million deficit in their high needs block. Kent are in the 65, 67, I think it is in total, and you can see there are a number here that are quite significant. When they presented this to us, one of the things I asked them to do was this next slide, actually, which was the deficit as the proportion of budget, because actually the net deficit doesn't really give you the full picture as to how local authorities are performing in this. So I wanted to see kind of where we were in terms of the proportion of our budget. Our budget is relatively high compared to many. And so this one kind of showed where people were in terms of their deficit as a proportion of their budget. So you can see that there are local authorities here who have a deficit in excess of their budget, over 100% of budget, and very high. And actually, in this line, we are I guess in a more favourable position than we look on the previous slide, because actually our deficit as a proportion of budget overall is not as significant as many of these others. And actually, interestingly, when you see Surrey, their deficit as a proportion of budget it doesn't actually have them in the top proportion there, even though that's an £80 million total deficit position. So there's some really interesting emerging data around this, and I wanted to share that because I think it providing context of where we are around this nationally. The other thing, and this came out of the County Treasurer's report, and it's one of the pieces of feedback around equity of funding in high needs, and it isn't something that that's been discussed. Certainly not with me. It's not an issue that's arisen significantly. I gather from some of the other local authorities that I've spoken to, this is something that has been a concern. So I wanted to start to look at it and as a real issue, and it was to look at a local comparative, a local authority of a similar size, and so what you can see on this slide here is the total high needs block before any deductions, etc., that we receive and that Buckinghamshire receive. And I should point out that I'm not suggesting Buckinghamshire are receiving too much money, just looking at the equity around this. And then the total pupil numbers that are in the system in these two local authorities, and a really very detailed analysis, a crude analysis of what that means in terms of average per pupil funding, if you were to look at it that way. And what you can see is there is a significant disparity in the amount of high needs block funding that's being received in Buckinghamshire in comparison to where we are. Now, there will be some reasons for that around area cost adjustments and those kind of things. There will be some things that would have an impact on that, but not to the tune of £25 million, which is, with a bit of rounding, is the number we're talking about there. So this is something that Neil's taken a bit more of a look at, and the issue relates back to the point when the high needs block was created, and the fact that a significant proportion of the high needs block is based on historic spend, and it's based on historic spend at a moment in time. It's taken from a moment in time, and that moment in time was very much a point where local authorities had more control over how they were utilising money, whether that was within schools or high needs or early years, etc. There was far more control over that, and that position has been locked in. So there is a concern there, and this is a very crude analysis, and I'm not suggesting that it's something that we're necessarily taking forward without much more detailed work around this. But it is something I wanted to really flag, because it is something that is creating now for me a concern, something that we ought to be looking at and actually making a case for in terms of our position around high needs. And I think to date, the conversation and the debate has been around quantum of funding into high needs, that the whole system needs more money. And I don't think that debate is going anywhere. That is still an issue. But I also think that there is a view, that there ought to be a view of how the money that is being used is being apportioned across the system, particularly when you do have some local authorities that are managing to stay within budgets. This particular analysis starts to give you a feel for why some local authorities are in significantly worse place than others. As an action from this, I have asked, so I've raised it with the F40 group specifically to say, is this something we can do a more detailed analysis of on a broader scale across a larger group of local authorities? They got, like I said on that previous slide, they got a 50% response to their previous survey, and actually this is something I think that as what could be an inequity in funding in the system is very much within their position around engaging with the DFE around funding issues. So I won't say any more about it than that at this stage. It is a line of inquiry that we're now going to take, and I will, when we get more detail and more analysis on this, I will share it. It is something I wanted forum members to be aware of as a potential concern. And as you can obviously see, with those pupil numbers there, and the broad comparison you might make between Gloucestershire and Buckinghamshire, a £25 million additional income into their high needs budget is a significant variance, and would, if we were to have that kind of funding, would make me sleep better at night, which is of course important. The only thing, before I take questions on any of those bits I've just been through, the thing I would just say, and I've tried to, in the report, just kind of left a statement there at the end around just trying to get some feedback from members around where we feel we are in this position and how comfortable people feel with what's taking place in this area. I've just summarised some of the kind of local activity around this. We do have work taking place around the joint disciplinary high needs strategy. We've reported on that regularly. We'll continue to report on that focus on earlier intervention to reduce high cost placements, to have an impact on overall spend, and the quality of the provision that we provide for vulnerable young people is really important. I think I've said before, it isn't a panacea in terms of funding. It isn't £5.5 million worth of funding that's going to materialise, which is why we then started to look at some of the other areas we were spending money, diseconomies of scale, increases in the costs of the advisory teacher service, and the 1 in 40 model. And we are continue to review those, and we'll come back to the forum in June with a position on all of those, having consulted more with the sector around them. But all of these things, all told, are not the game changer for a £5.5 million recovery in terms of high needs. We've looked at it previously. We forecast what the future might look like. in terms of trying to get the budget back to a point where we are balancing, which is potentially possible, but in terms of a recovery of the kind of position we're now moving into, that is a big ask with the kind of activity that we and the flexibility we've got within our current system to do that. I have put on the right there the two kind of key things that are happening nationally around this, and we are expecting the SEND to report. I mean, I guess with COVID there have been other priorities at their end, a lot of other things going on, but we are told that the SEND review will report this term, and that there will be a review of the high needs formula and notional SEM funding as an outcome of that. So we are expecting a review of that kind of high needs formula, the way it operates, potentially the notional funding that goes into mainstream. And those are contexts that are coming, we're expecting, just told by the DfE, will be coming this year. Overall, we are, like I said at the start around this, we are in a position where I feel like we've got better understanding of control over our budget. We're not reporting significant variances to where we started and planned the year, which I think has been a real step forward. We are moving some of these other activities forward, but we're not at a point where I can see a recovery plan that I could put my hand on my heart and say, this is going to get us to a point where we're starting to recover our deficit position. I will stop there. It's my kind of summary. I'm really interested, I think, just to get feedback and get a feel for how members see this area, the activities that we're undertaking and the things that are likely to come nationally, and how we as a forum might want to kind of take this issue forward, in future years to try to start to get back to a better place on this. I will stop there and I'll stop sharing as well so people can see properly.
Okay, thank you very much, Phil. Kirsten, you've had your hand patiently up for a very long time. It's probably aching by now.
It's more an observation, because as Phil spoke further, he kind of answered it to a certain extent. But it's interesting that you've made your comparison between Gloucestershire and Buckinghamshire, because Buckinghamshire is a wholly grammar school, secondary, modern school divided county. Now, I know you're saying that any one given factor wouldn't explain that 25 million, but it also has models whereby a lot of the additional needs support is centred within the mainstream schools, and there's been a period of, in the secondary moderns, and therefore they've had a very different structure and infrastructure for some period of time. And I suppose all I'm saying is I would be interested to see comparators, like you're saying, with other counties that have other systems that haven't got that historical track record of building up the infrastructure that means that some of the things that are going on within the high needs work streams rely on, for example, significant investment in resource and staffing and buildings and appropriate provision in mainstream schools, which is, so Buckinghamshire, I just happen to know that a little bit better, gives me a sense of, well, are we comparing like with like, or are we looking at how things have moved across time that put us at a bigger distance from why they may be, their funding distribution works better for them. I don't know. I think it would be really valuable to have more of those comparators.
Thank you.
Can I respond to that, Andrew? Is that okay?
Please, yeah.
Okay, yeah. I that's a really interesting view of Bucks, and I was very conscious that we aren't comparing like for like in terms of the provision, etc., that's in counties. I think and I did say it's crude at this stage, and we do need to do more around this. My kind of takeaway from it has been very much looking back at the way the high needs formula was created. What we've done is, much like the national funding formula in the school side, locked in some inequities that, ultimately, however they've structured their system over in the past, with a similar pupil numbers in county, they're still receiving now significantly more funding per pupil than we would on high needs, and it does need a much better kind of look at this to really understand that. But it is something that I think is a case for us to be starting to make about the way that the government might start to look at the quantum of funding moving forward, because I think Buckinghamshire has its own deficit. I mean, if you look at them on the previous slides that were on there, they do have a deficit. I think it's around 8 million. I'd have to look back, but they are, even with that additional funding, still operating into a deficit position. And this feels to me like it is something that needs to be properly understood, so that we can start to have a really good debate with the DFE and the Education Skills Funding Agency about how the funding situation might move forward nationally. And I think I guess my reservation around the discussions around quantum is just asking for more is always a real challenge, because it doesn't have the depth to it. And I think there is an opportunity here for us to, with the F40, to look at this in a different way and say, yes, it's quantum, but there's also an equity thing here. So it isn't just about giving everybody more money. It's about making sure it's in the right places.
Okay, thank you very much. Any more questions about the national data and the national comparisons that Phil showed us?
No one else, Andrew.
Okay.
That I can see.
And then moving on to the key activities that Phil mentioned on his slide. Any reflections or comments about those key activities, or what we should or shouldn't be doing?
Andrew, that I can see. Oh, Dave Alexander.
Dave. Hello, Dave.
Hello.
Hello.
I put it in chat, but naive question, is there a clear time frame that you're working towards in order to make these savings? Because that obviously changes the strategy or strategies which you implement.
Yeah, I think so. We've been looking at a 5-year plan around the early intervention work, because we know that will take time to embed across the system and have a real impact. I have shared in a previous forum, and I apologize, I maybe should have put that in this pack as well. How that kind of that plan looks in terms of a 3 and 5 year kind of impact on the high needs spend. What it kind of articulated again, which is why we were starting to look at some of these other areas for saving, is that early intervention as an approach is definitely the right way forward, but it isn't the panacea for recovery that I think possibly the strategy, any strategy as it is written, suggests that it could be. And I think that reflects the fact that we were setting a £1.2 million deficit budget last year, because actually when I started in that position, looking at that deficit and looking at the early intervention models and looking at that, it felt like that was an achievable thing. You could move towards different models and start to recover that level of deficit. Where we are now in terms of the high needs positions, isn't recoverable through that high needs. But it is, certainly from my perspective, a five-year plan around the early intervention. I think then in terms of recovery, that is very much a longer term position, because at £14.5 million at the end of this year, and what will, with COVID, will almost certainly be a similar kind of deficit budget set for next year. Notwithstanding we haven't shared that yet, it is taking us to a point where you're talking about multiple years worth of recovery, unless there is an intervention made around some of the national conversations that are going on around the SEND review and the formula.
Okay, thank you. Kirsten, your hand is up. Is that from before?
I'm afraid not.
Okay, no, excellent. No, I'm pleased.
In terms of the 1 in 40 model, obviously, you'll remember from last time round when there was some more heated debate about the transfer of the funds across from the schools block into the high needs, and we've just voted for that to happen again this year because of obviously those arguments rehearsed, in as much as that high need debt, if you like, was part of taking funding from schools and so on. I won't go back to that. So where do you see the 1 in 40 going, say, next year? Are we going to be looking at a situation where it's going to be propped up or supported by a transfer from the schools block, or do you think that the stream of work around that is going to put us in a position where we have a different model?
I think so. Oh, sorry, Andrew.
No, thank you.
Yeah.
So, Phil, yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, my hope is that this is a tipping point in terms of high needs this year, because we have those two major activities at the DFEs, and at this moment in time, the 1 in 40 is proposed to continue for next year. And if we propose any changes to it, that will obviously come through consultation. We have started to look at whether there's a different way of doing it, and looking at additional needs elements and budgets. It is far more complex, as Neil will attest to, than my initial thinking around that would be, in terms of making some changes to the model. So we will look at that in more detail and share some of that, and it's part of the kind of forward plan in terms of forum work and the working group I'd like to get into. I think beyond this coming year, I would hope that the outcome of the SEND review and the review of the SEND formula, the high needs formula, and I have been told that national SEN funding would be looked at as part of that, that we're not in a position where a 1 in 40 model would be necessary. But I think we have to take that at the moment in time when we start to see the DFE's views. We can't, at this stage, it's very, very difficult to second guess where either of those two key activities from central government are going to come out. We don't know what the outcomes of those are likely to be. So I think it feels like it remains necessary at the moment in this forthcoming year. I would hope that we will be in a position where the national changes have been implemented so that we don't need to be subsidising in that way moving forward.
Okay, thank you, Phil. Does anybody else have any questions at all, or anything else they'd like to comment in terms of those key activities or extra activities that should be considered?
Can't see anyone, Andrew.
No?
No one.
Okay, thank you very much. I think that then takes us on to the, excuse me, I apologise, to the schools forum elections. Joe.
Thanks, Andrew. The schools forum elections take place every 2 years when half of the schools and academies members' current term of office ends on the 31st of March. The seats up for election this time are detailed in a table in the report. Some of the elections have already been undertaken and the results are outlined in the report. For the remaining seats, I'll be seeking nominations from the relevant phase of governors and primary heads via email tomorrow. The nomination period ends on the 12th of February. I'll be publishing the results of the nomination round and any subsequent elections on the forum webpage and in the WhatsApp Gov bulletin and the Heads Up bulletin. Does anybody have any questions?
Hand is still up, I think that. Oh, Jackie.
Yes, Jackie. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe. I have emailed you previously to say that I will not be standing for re-election in the secondary academy sector, and therefore this will be my last meeting after 15 years plus on Schools Forum. I hope you managed to find sufficient interest amongst governors to elect future positions, but I just wanted to confirm that I will not be standing. Thank you. I have very much enjoyed my time on the schools forum, but I need to make changes to my life. So this is one of them, I'm afraid.
I'll therefore may belatedly add you to the comments I made at the beginning of the meeting with respect to other members. And thank you, Jackie, also very much for all of your contributions to the Schools Forum, which have been really valuable. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Andrew.
Okay. Any other questions about the elections?
No.
David Metcalf?
Probably a sensible time, Andrew and Joe, to say that I'm stepping down as the head of Burdick Primary School at Easter, and I'm moving out of county, so very sadly would also have to step down from Schools Forum at that time. Just a big thank you to everyone. It's been a really useful and valuable experience all round.
Okay, thank you, David. And again, also to you, thank you very much from Schools Forum for all of your hard work to support the work of the forum. Thank you. Any other comments or other people who are leaving?
No one else, Andrew.
No. Okay, thank you very much. And that takes us on to the work plan for next year.
Yeah, so the work plan was outlined included in the papers. I think the key thing to note in there is we've added into the work plan this year a focus around COVID-19 and impact there. So monitoring, assessing the impact of COVID on school budgets and how that's moving forward. We are still continuing to request feedback from schools around impact, and I will share the analysis of that remotely via email when that's available. But it is something that we'll continue to want to look at. I think obviously the other key area, in terms of mainstream funding, like I said at the start, in relation to the schools block, our ability to influence mainstream funding is very limited now because it is within the national funding formula. So the bulk of, I think, our work is going to continue to remain around the high needs issues that we've just discussed. I think we have struggled, I think, to move some of that forward in terms of working group stuff this year, and that purely down to COVID and availability, and frankly, head teachers and schools having many other things to focus on through the last 3 periods. But we will in the new, as we start this new year, need to start looking at getting the working group together to look at some of those high needs challenges. And then, like I say, the COVID. Yeah, I don't know whether there's any questions around what's in the work plan or anything that's missing from everyone's perspective.
Does anybody have any questions?
Not seeing any, Andrew.
No. Okay, thank you very much for that, Phil. And lastly, F40.
Yeah. So the only thing I would say on the F40 side at the moment is they are continuing to look at how they work with the DFE and the SFA. We've touched on them in most meetings, and certainly the last meeting we talked about their work with the DFE around the COVID and then their ability to engage with the DFE directly around the issues that schools are seeing impacting on their finances in relation to COVID. So their focus as a group this year is going to be around continuing around the inequity in the national funding formula. That issue hasn't gone away. There's still a concern about the way the national funding formula operates, and things like the 1 in 40 are there to kind of address that. That issue hasn't gone anywhere. It's just got lost in what are a whole range of different issues that we've all faced in 2020. So they'll still continue to focus around that national funding formula issue. Impact on COVID, on schools from the COVID situation is their other priority, and increasingly looking at the high needs issues, both in terms of the quantum of funding, which I think they've seen as a concern generally, obviously, as we all do, but also now have escalated some of these issues around the inequity as well. So that focus around reviewing and understanding the way that funding is allocated across the country and seeing how that operates. So there's a kind of a 3-track element there that will continue to keep pushing. I'm remain a member of the executive group, working with them on that, so I'm able to represent the views of the forum and schools in Gloucestershire around this. I think if there are areas of concern that we have around funding, and this is something that I think to consider, maybe after the meeting or even now, if there's something to share, if there are areas that fall outside of those kind of three key threads that they're currently looking at, the funding formula, COVID, and high needs. There are other areas where we feel there could be a case for engaging with the DfE and lobbying around change around funding. We are in a position to do that through that group, and it is something worth considering. Certainly I've seen from the conversations I've had with them over the last year, and others coming into that group as well, that the group has picked up that emphasis around high needs. When I first started working at the F40, there was no focus around the high needs issue from their perspective. It was all about the core national funding formula. They have now picked that up, and it is a good way for us to engage directly with policy around funding issues. So, those are the key areas they're focused on, and I would just, I guess, reiterate that point, that can ask members to consider whether there are other areas we would like them to engage on our behalf in the future. Stop.
Okay, thank you. Are there any responses to Phil concerning the F40 update at all?
Any, Andrew?
No. Okay, thank you very much. That brings us to the end of the agenda. Thank you very much for your time this afternoon.
Andrew, can I just raise some feedback information on the budget consultation?
So I do beg your pardon, Suzanne. I saw your hand come up and then it went down and it's up again. I'm so sorry. Yes.
I've just received some feedback just to say that the budget consultation did get put on WhatsApp.gov on the 7th of January and heads up, and it went in the school's bulletin on the 21st of December. So hopefully people will have been able to pick that up.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much, Suzanne. Jackie.
I just wanted to say thank you very much for that, Suzanne, and look forward to seeing it in similar forms of advertisement next year as well. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much, both. So therefore, that brings us to the end of the meeting. Thank you very much for your time this afternoon. The next meeting, I think, is on the 17th of June, which seems a very long time away at the moment. Hopefully there'll be a lot of us will have vaccinations and life will be struggling back to normal by then. Let us hope anyway. So again, thank you very much. And therefore I close the meeting at 3:29 p.m. Thank you very much.